In 1828, Nuremberg became the stage for a mystery no one was prepared to solve. A teenage boy appeared in its streets, carrying 2 letters and a past he could not explain. He was alone. His clothes were worn. He moved slowly, as if every step had to be learned for the first time. He seemed frightened by noise, by people, by open space, and by the ordinary world around him. In his hand, he carried 2 letters. One letter said he had been raised in secret by a poor man. Another letter claimed to come from his mother. Together, they gave just enough information to create a story, and just enough silence to create a mystery. When people asked where he came from, he could barely answer. When they asked who had sent him, he did not know. But when someone placed a pen in front of him, he wrote a name. Kaspar Hauser. That name would soon move through police offices, royal courts, newspapers, and history books. Some would call him a victim. Others would call him a fraud. Some would whisper that he was a hidden prince. 5 years later, Kaspar Hauser was dead, and the question that began in Nuremberg has never fully released him. This is the story of Kaspar Hauser, a boy without a past, a case file with its final page still missing. Nuremberg was a city accustomed to strangers. Soldiers passed through its gates. Merchants crowded its markets. Pilgrims walked beneath its towers. Prisoners vanished behind its walls. But on May 26, 1828, a stranger arrived whom the city could not explain. A young man stood in Unschlittplatz, a square shaped by trade, storage, tallow, and the quiet routines of ordinary work. It was not a place of miracles. It was not a place where legends were expected to begin. And yet, on that ordinary square, one of the strangest mysteries of the 19th century opened its first page. The boy carried a letter addressed to a cavalry captain. He also repeated one sentence, as though it had been given to him for this exact moment. I want to be a cavalryman, as my father was. The sentence was simple, but it carried the weight of a hidden story. It implied a father. It implied a past. And the boy standing before them seemed to possess neither. People brought him to the authorities. At first, he appeared to be a vagrant, perhaps a simple-minded youth, perhaps someone abandoned by a family that no longer wished to carry the burden of him. Then the letters were examined. One letter claimed that the writer had received the boy as an infant on October 7th, 1812. It said the boy had been kept hidden. It said he had been taught reading, writing, and religion. The second letter claimed to be from the boy's mother. It gave his name. It hinted at his father. The story was neat. Too neat. The authorities were left with 3 impossible pieces. The boy seemed ignorant of the world, yet he could write his name. The letters explained his existence, yet they offered almost nothing that could be verified. And the place where he appeared was so ordinary that the scene became even more unsettling. In every mystery, the first scene matters, because whoever controls the first scene often controls the story that follows. From the beginning, Kaspar Hauser was not simply a boy to be rescued. He was a mystery no one could ignore. As Kaspar slowly learned to communicate, he began to tell a story that horrified the city. According to Kaspar, much of his life had been spent in a dark and cramped room. He slept on straw. He lived on bread and water. He had little, or perhaps no contact with another human being. His only companion, he said, was a wooden horse. He did not describe a childhood. He described a life sealed away from the world. At some point, a mysterious man entered the story. Kaspar said this man taught him a few words. He taught him to write his name, and he taught him the sentence that had brought him to Nuremberg. I want to be a cavalryman as my father was. Then, Kaspar said, the man led him toward the city and left him there. If the account was true, the crime was almost beyond imagination. A child had not merely been abandoned. He had been removed from the human world, kept in darkness, preserved in silence, then released like a message no one knew how to read. But there is a hard rule in the Kaspar Hauser case. The more emotionally powerful a detail is, the more carefully it must be handled. The cell was never found. The captor was never identified. The story depended on Kaspar himself. It depended on the people who questioned him. And it depended on a public already hungry for mystery. Still, something about him disturbed observers. He was frightened by things others barely noticed. To some, these were the marks of isolation. To others, they were something more troubling. Was this the damage of a life spent in darkness? Or was it the performance of someone who had learned how helplessness could protect him? Nuremberg did not simply shelter Kaspar Hauser. It began to study him. He was eventually placed in the care of George Friedrich Daumer, a teacher and philosopher. Daumer tried to educate him. He observed him closely. He tried to bring language, memory, and order to a life that seemed to have begun in darkness. But Kaspar was not living in an ordinary age. This was a century fascinated by education, innocence, and human nature. Europe wanted to know what civilization made of a person. It also wanted to know what remained when civilization was taken away. Kaspar became the perfect vessel for that obsession. People came to see him. Scholars discussed him. Newspapers carried the mystery beyond Bavaria. Soon, he was called the Orphan of Europe. But that title was not only a tribute. It was a burden. To some, Kaspar was innocence rescued from darkness. To others, he was a damaged young man whose suffering revealed the cruelty of humans. To skeptics, he was something else entirely. An actor who had found the perfect role. The more attention he received, the harder it became to separate the boy from the performance around him. Every gesture became evidence. If he seemed confused, believers saw trauma. If he seemed clever, skeptics saw fraud. If he cried, one side saw suffering, the other saw theater. Kaspar was no longer free to simply exist. He had become a question people wanted to own. Then the mystery turned violent. On October 17th, 1829, while living in the house of George Friedrich Daumer, Kaspar Hauser was found bleeding from a wound on his forehead. He claimed that a hooded man had attacked him. The stranger, Kaspar said, had come with a warning. He must die. The story hit Nuremberg like a spark falling into dry straw. Until that moment, Kaspar's past had been tragic, strange, and almost impossible to explain. But now it seemed dangerous. If someone had truly tried to kill him, then his imprisonment was not just the act of a cruel unknown captor. It was part of something larger, something hidden, something still watching him. To those who believed in him, the attack changed everything. Kaspar was no longer only the abandoned boy from the dark cell. He was a target. Perhaps the same force that had kept him hidden for years had returned to silence him before he could reveal too much. But doubt arrived almost as quickly as fear. No attacker was found. No clear evidence appeared. The circumstances were confused. And shortly before the incident, Kaspar had reportedly been in conflict with Daumer, who had accused him of dishonesty. That detail was enough to split public opinion. To believers, the wound was proof of a conspiracy. To skeptics, it was something else entirely. The first visible sign that Kaspar had learned the power of attention. The wound solved nothing. It made the mystery darker. From that moment on, every event around Kaspar carried two shadows. One belonged to a hunted victim. The other belonged to a young man who may have been constructing his own legend. And when one story can be read in two completely opposite ways, the public rarely becomes calmer. It chooses sides. Every mystery attracts theories. But Kaspar Hauser inspired one theory, so powerful that it survived almost everything else. What if he was never a nobody? What if he was the lost hereditary prince of Baden? The claim was astonishing. Kaspar, according to the legend, had been born into the Grand Ducal House of Baden and stolen away as an infant. A dying child had supposedly been placed in his cradle instead. The true heir had then been hidden from the world, so another branch of the family could inherit power. It was a theory with everything people wanted to believe. A stolen prince, a false death, a court conspiracy, a hidden imprisonment, and silent enemies willing to kill to protect the secret. Suddenly, the attacks on Kaspar seemed to make sense. If he really was a prince, then the man in the shadows was not simply an attacker. He was the guardian of a stolen succession. The theory transformed Kaspar from a strange, abandoned youth into something much larger. A rightful heir erased from history. And Europe loved such stories. It loved royal scandal. It loved hidden bloodlines. It loved the image of innocence robbed of its name and throne. Kaspar seemed to fit the role almost too well. But this is the danger of beautiful theories. They do not need much evidence. They feed on absence. They turn silence into conspiracy. They turn contradiction into confirmation. And that was always the weakness of the Baden theory. It was unforgettable, but it was never truly proven. For generations, possibility wore the mask of truth. Then, nearly 2 centuries later, the legend met something it could not easily escape: science. In the early 1830s, a British aristocrat entered the story. His name was Philip Henry Stanhope, the 4th Earl Stanhope. He was wealthy, influential, and fascinated by the mystery of Kaspar Hauser. To many, Stanhope seemed like the kind of man who could finally break the case open. He had money, he had connections, and he had the social power to follow leads that others could not. For Kaspar, his arrival must have seemed like a new beginning. Perhaps this foreign nobleman could uncover the truth. Perhaps he could take Kaspar away from suspicion. Perhaps he could give him the identity everyone kept imagining, but no one could prove. Stanhope investigated. He spent money. He pursued leads. He even explored possible connections beyond Bavaria. But the great revelation never came. The searches failed to produce firm answers. The more Kaspar's story was examined, the less certain it became. And slowly, the noble protector who had once seemed captivated began to doubt. That change mattered, because Kaspar's life depended on belief. He had no stable family, no normal profession, no secure identity. He had patrons, he had guardians, and above all, he had a story. If that story began to fail, what was left? Eventually, Kaspar was moved to Ansbach, where he lived under the care of the schoolmaster Johann George Meyer. The atmosphere there was stricter, less enchanted, less forgiving. He found work as a copyist, but the life was painfully small compared with the destiny others had once imagined for him. No palace, no throne, no revelation, only documents, routine, and doubt. The legend was shrinking, and for a life sustained by other people's belief, doubt could feel like a second disappearance. December 1833. Ansbach was cold. Kaspar Hauser was no longer the miracle of Nuremberg. He was a controversial young man, hemmed in by doubt, still waiting for the answer that had haunted him from the beginning. One day a man approached him. The stranger promised to tell him the truth about his origins. For Kaspar, no promise could have cut deeper. Before the scandals, before the theories, before the guardians and patrons, there had always been one question: who am I? So he went to the Hofgarten, the court garden at Ansbach, to meet the stranger. What happened there remains uncertain. Kaspar returned gravely wounded in the chest. He claimed the stranger had stabbed him after placing a small purse in his hands. Inside the purse was a note, but like the earlier letters, the note did not resolve the mystery. It spoke in fragments. It hinted. It obscured. Even in his final days, the truth remained just out of reach. Kaspar declined over the next 3 days. On December 17th, 1833, Kaspar Hauser died. He had arrived as a question. He disappeared as one. If Kaspar was a fraud, where did he come from? Who prepared him? Why was he so convincing to so many people? And what kind of deception carries a man all the way to his death? So what do we do with the case of Kaspar Hauser? There are 3 main ways to read the evidence. The first theory is that Kaspar was telling the truth. He was a child of extreme isolation. He had been imprisoned, neglected, and released by someone who never wanted to be found. There are reasons people believe this. His behavior seemed deeply abnormal. His fear of ordinary life appeared genuine. His slow adjustment to society looked like the recovery of someone deprived of human contact. But the weakness is obvious. No prison was ever found. No captor was identified. No family was confirmed. The suffering may have been real, but the full story remains unproven. The second theory is that Kaspar was a lost prince. This is the version that made him legendary. It explains the secrecy. It explains the danger. It explains why someone might have wanted him dead. but it asks us to accept a large conspiracy with very little direct proof. Modern DNA evidence has made this theory much weaker. The romantic version of Kaspar as the stolen heir of Baden is powerful, but power is not the same as truth. The third theory is that Kaspar was an imposter. In this version, the letters were part of a setup. The prison story was invented, exaggerated, or performed. The attacks may have been staged. The final wound may have been self-inflicted and accidentally fatal. There are reasons skeptics believe this. Some details seem too convenient. Some behaviors seem theatrical. Some claims shifted under pressure. But this theory also has a problem. If Kaspar invented the story, then the invention itself was extraordinary. A boy or young man with no clear background appeared in Nuremberg and convinced teachers, doctors, nobles, officials, and ordinary citizens that he was one of the strangest human beings they had ever seen. If he was acting, the performance fooled a city. If he was lying, the lie consumed his life. And if he staged the final attack, then the legend he created finally destroyed him. That is why the case refuses to close neatly. Each theory explains something. Each theory fails somewhere. The victim theory explains his suffering, but not the missing captor. The prince theory explains the danger, but not the lack of proof. The imposter theory explains the contradictions, but not the full cost of the deception. Kaspar Hauser remains trapped between them. Not proven prince, not proven fraud, not fully explained victim. Only a young man who appeared from nowhere, carried a story no one could verify, and died before anyone could finally decide what he had been. Kaspar Hauser was buried in Ansbach. His grave inscription called him a riddle of his time. Unknown birth, mysterious death. But perhaps Kaspar was more than a riddle. Perhaps he was also a warning, because the world did not only investigate him. It consumed him. Officials needed a case. Doctors needed a subject. Romantics needed a prince. Skeptics needed a fraud. Newspapers needed a story. Everyone came to Kaspar with a question, but many had already chosen the answer. Somewhere beneath all of that was a young man who may never have known who he was. Or worse, a young man who learned that the only way to survive was to become what others expected him to be. That is why the Kaspar Hauser mystery still feels alive. Not because there are no facts, but because the facts do not form a complete person. A boy appeared in Nuremberg carrying letters. 5 years later, he died in Ansbach with another strange note at the center of the story. Between those two moments, Europe tried to solve him. It failed. So the question passes to us. Was Kaspar Hauser a hidden prisoner? A royal heir? A brilliant imposter? Or something more tragic? A broken young man trapped between truth and invention? The evidence can take us close, but not all the way. And maybe that is why his story belongs in the blank pages of history. Not because the world forgot Kaspar Hauser, but because after nearly 200 years, the truth is still missing.